Hi, welcome back to Future Fast. And once again, we have Ben Murnane with us. And for those of you who have missed the first part and here for the first time, I sincerely urge you go back, look up the first part of the conversation where he shares his journey. And believe me, it's nothing close to what you think you've heard of before. So maybe I'll just put it in one line that it is perhaps two in a million kind of a story. And for what it is, other than that, it was Ben's first book, correct?
Yes,
So, other than it is Ben's first book, the story is perhaps one in 2 million, not two in 1 million. So, go get the story, and you will appreciate it. What I'm talking about, and the rest of you, you are here because you've already heard the first part. So, thank you, welcome back, and hope you will enjoy it as much as I'm looking forward to enjoying it. So, Ben, once again, thank you so much for uh, agreeing to do this podcast with me and sharing your journey earlier and now uh, putting yourself to talk about why you want to write and tell stories. Why is it so important?
sure. Well, thanks so much again for having me, and it's a real pleasure. Um, that's such a broad question, such an interesting question. Why is it important to write or to tell stories? I mean, there's so much that has been, I suppose, written about this over the years, but stories are what we are as human beings. Stories are how we experience the world. They're the things we tell ourselves that keep us going. They're how we kind of navigate the world. Even if you think of the memory, even within our own minds, the kind of story that we have assembled for ourselves in our brains from our memory, which is our life story, which tells us who we are and where we want to go and how we keep going. And so I think storytelling is essential to what it means to be human. We don't know what we are without history, without geography, without kind of studying the future, which I know you're doing and I'm interested in too. We need to know not only where we've come from, but I think where we're going or where we want to go if we're going to plan toward the future. So, storytelling, I suppose, in the broadest sense, is the whole world around us. It's the media, it's Netflix, it's blockbuster movies, obviously novels and short stories and nonfiction books. So to me, I've just always been interested in being part of that process. I mean, I'm obviously a fan of storytelling as a consumer. I like certain shows and movies. We all do. We all have kind of our favorite things that we like, our favorite stories that we like to watch over and over again, or maybe read over and over again because they connect with a part of us. They tell us something about ourselves. Obviously, there's been a lot written over the years about myths and ancient myths and how they feed into even the narratives of kind of movies that are still being made today. Joseph Campbell wrote a book in the 70s on the monomyth, which you may know about. Kind of, he studied a number of different cultures and kind of showed how across human time and human societies there were commonalities in terms of the stories we told ourselves about the world and how it works and our place in it, and that kind of influenced a lot of Hollywood screenwriters. So I think, obviously, going back even before writing, there was an oral tradition of telling stories around the campfire. And so I think since human beings have been human beings, we've drawn cave paintings, we've told stories around the fire. Ultimately, that led to the printing press and the internet and Netflix. So you just can't get away from storytelling, right? And so it's an essential part of who we are.
Well, I was just thinking, you are such a man of contradiction, right? One is you like acting, where you could be invisible while being in front of everybody, right? And
Yes.
other is you're a published writer, author, writing stories, which may carry any other wrapper, but it's actually almost being naked from your thought perspective in front of everybody.
Sure.
Isn't that a crazy contradiction? I mean,
Yes. I mean, yes, I totally get where you're coming from, but I'll
you
I'll
are a
explain.
private person, and
Yes, yes, yeah, yes. Oh, yeah, absolutely. In a way. So I'll explain to you something about my psychology, which I don't know if I've ever explained this way before, but maybe your viewers will understand. Maybe it'll seem totally bizarre. You tell me. But like, I don't mind revealing my most private thoughts and my most personal reflections and even things that are painful when I'm controlling the narrative, and that's what writing a book is. That's what writing a story is. You're kind of shaping these experiences into something that you control. So when I make sense of the world by turning it into a book, that's me shaping the world as I would like it to be and as I would like other people to understand my experience. Acting is kind of like that as well. You're up there, you've learned the lines, you're controlling the narrative, you're presenting a polished kind of view of this character. And so it's all about control from my point of view. What I find, and this is why I say this is something about my own psychology. I don't mind. I don't find it difficult to write something personal and then talk about it because it's based on something I've willingly revealed and put out there. I find like social situations like in bars or in parties, which are not controlled and which are random and which are, you might have to come up with something on the spot to have a conversation with somebody. That I find very difficult. That's outside of my control. And I just can't, you know, cope in some of those scenarios precisely because it's not structured. It's not a structured narrative. It's not a story that I've been able to shape in advance. So it's when the story gets all random and too much like real life, that's what I find difficult.
well, but the first book you wrote was pretty much about yourself, so it was perhaps the closest to real.
Yes,
And
yep,
the next book you're probably already started writing, what you mentioned earlier, is also about your life. So, how easy or difficult it is to write because knowing that people are going to judge you, right? I mean, I think biggest complex we go through is about being judged.
sure. I
So,
I mean, yes, I I never been too worried about that. I mean, I don't want to be confronted with other people's judgments. They can keep them to themselves. That's why I do find social media a difficult world to be a part of because, there's a lot of pylons and there's a lot of kind of vitriol in the comments if you post something. And I think when I post or if I was to post things personal that are personal in nature on social media, I just wouldn't read the comments because I just can't kind of cope with that in your face kind of reactions of other people all the time. When you write a book, it's a little bit different. People might write a review or they might post their thoughts somewhere, but for the most part, I suppose you read a book and you experience it within your own world. You're not out there confronting the author about it all the time. So I've never been too worried about people thinking whatever they think in terms of reading my book and maybe not thinking I'm the best person. I try to be honest in the books about who I've been, and certainly the memoirs, the books about my life, and people will judge you for that. I judge myself all the time on actions I've taken or not taken. So I think if you're going to be a writer and you're going to be someone who tries to tell the truth in terms of whether it's your own experiences or a journalist or so on, you can't really get too hung up on what other people will think because um, you would never tell those true experiences. There definitely is a conflict between, wanting to be liked or wanting social approval and kind of doing something that maybe speaks to the truth of your own experiences. And I've certainly gone through moments in my life that were very humiliating, that were very difficult. And uh, so people might read that and they might judge you and they might think that you're a fool for having put those things out there. I've I've never been too, like I say, concerned about that, because for me it's about documenting these experiences for myself first and foremost. I mean, yes, I want them to reach other people too, but in order for the truth of my experience to reach other people, I first have to be truthful about that experience and how
So
I
does
write
that
about.
work like a therapy for you that you're having put it out?
Oh yeah, very much so. Yeah, very much so. Um, and it can be very hard. You mentioned this book that I've been writing about mine and Sandra's experience, us meeting, and kind of our story. It's the story of my illness and kind of Sandra's illness through her bone marrow transplant and since my bone marrow transplant. And I've been trying to write a sequel to 200 Million for 20 years, and I found it very hard because uh, some of those times in my life, you just don't want to revisit, or it can be hard to revisit when you have a day job and you're doing other things and you don't want to go into those deep emotional places. But I think the only way to tell a story that's worthwhile is to kind of be faithful to those experiences, even if it is very hard. So it is a contradiction, because we write a book, we hope that it becomes popular, we hope it resonates with other people, that it finds an audience, but you also kind of have to be not too concerned about that audience, I think, in order to tell a true story. So you do kind of have to hold that contradiction in your mind.
How easy or difficult was it to get Sandra's buy-in for you to be doing it? Because it's just not about you. You don't need permission for you to talk about yourself. But
Well, I still haven't got that yet. So if you could help me with that, that would be great. So, so no, no, I think Sandra's interested, I suppose, in our journey together and interested in seeing that out there. But I don't know. That's an interesting question, and that's a difficult point, because Sandra's a very private person, and I think would not have put herself out there in a book unless she met me, this idiot writer. Um, so I think we're still navigating that. I'm trying to get her to be more honest and kind of more raw about writing about some of these experiences, but sometimes you want to forget about it and just move on. So I think we'll find a balance, like we've found a balance in our marriage over the years, but it's still a work in progress. So so
so,
that's the answer.
are you going to write in third person? I mean, are you going to make those two characters fictional names, or would you write it? I mean, give your own names to it. I mean, how would you approach it? I mean,
As it is right now, it's our real names, and it's our story. I think what makes it an interesting story is that it's true, because you could write a fictional story about two people with a rare illness meeting each other, across an ocean, but people might think that's unbelievable if it's fiction, but it's a true story, and I think that's what makes it interesting. So,
it sounds like a movie story, right? I mean,
well, fingers crossed, you never know. Like I said, I'm always interested in the next big idea, the next big project. So, if we get this book out there and if people like it, who knows? Maybe the Hallmark Channel will pick it up and we'll have a lifetime TV movie made of our lives.
oh well, for that a much bigger permission would be required, because it's just, I think, number of people who watch a movie or a TV would be 100 times more than the number of people who read books. So,
That's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. And there are, I mean, don't get me wrong, there are selfish motivations that come into it as well. I mean, it's not all honorable. I mean, of course, you write things because, yes, you want to tell the true experience and you want to tell the true story. That's the first prerequisite from my point of view. That's what makes it worth doing, even if it never finds an audience. But in the
mm,
back of my mind, yes, of course, I'm a writer. I hope I write a bestseller. I hope it finds an audience. I hope it might get picked up and made into a movie. So you do have aspirations for sure that you want to see some wider success and get a bestseller out there. So yes, of course, there are selfish motivations in terms of wanting to have a wider impact, but that's not the primary motivation.
But do you ever think that you should have been maybe 20 years back? Because this is such an odd time to be a writer, right? Given all this digital world where even machines write, right? I mean, it's much easier to write a book using AI. So, uh, do you ever think like that, that you should have, the technology should have been a little slow, or you should have been 20 years behind?
Well, I was writing books 20 years ago. I'm still doing it now, but I don't think like that personally. I tend to be an optimistic person. I tend to embrace the future. I operate in different spheres, if you like. Like, I obviously come from a university where I was in a humanities department, and I studied English literature, as you mentioned. I have a lot of friends who are artists, who work in theater, who are writers, musicians. I also, though, come from a business background in the sense that I work for a multi-million-dollar publishing company who's involved now in trying to figure out how we can use AI in our business. I suppose, obviously, did this book with Zoltan, which we mentioned, which was all about his journey as a futurist and his interest and promotion of transhumanism and transhumanist ideas. So, like, I see within kind of my artist friends and my writer friends a lot of trepidation and worry and backlash against developments like artificial intelligence and ChatGPT, and how, a couple of years from now, we might be able to type into Netflix, make me a movie about pandas on the moon starring Patrick Swayze, and it'll just make that movie for you. You're like, right then and
Which is a very strong possibility.
there. And obviously, to a lot of content creators, a lot of artists, people working in the creative industries, that's a scary prospect because it threatens jobs. It certainly threatens livelihoods. Um, I have friends who don't engage with artificial intelligence because they object to it morally or on principle. It's a betrayal of kind of their creativity as a person. I personally don't think that way. Like, I can't imagine writing an article before Google, but I did. I mean, I was writing articles before Google. But nowadays I find it such a useful and helpful tool to be able to kind of fact check things and research things on the fly instantly. I think of artificial intelligence as in that same vein, as a something that we can use to extend our abilities and the possibilities for what we do in our creative lives, not as a hindrance.
Oh,
Um,
well, I think my take is there are two parts to it, right? While I completely agree with you on whatever you're saying, because uh, the company that I run, we actually build applications using AI basically to make people use, rather, we focus more on small language models than large language models, right? I personally believe AI is most useful when we are able to make it work in a private environment rather than putting it out in public. Because
yeah,
the large multinationals take away all the learning out of you. So if you want to protect it while you still want to use it, that is where I find that useful. But at the same time, having said that, there are serious implications. See, I actually published a book on AI more as a handbook, but I edited, I did a study, rather, it's not fair to say I did a study, but I did look into 20 industries and kind of jobs. And from my perspective, what kind of jobs will be lost because of AI? Where
mm-hmm.
I think about nearly 80% of jobs that are presently paying jobs in those 20 industries will not be there in the next 10 years.
Yeah,
Okay. And I explained that some of the people who saw that, I've been scaremongering, I'm trying to scare people. And some of them are in absolute denial. I don't know whether they have even read what I'm saying, but I feel people just don't are refusing to look at what is. I mean, I'm explaining that what kind of a job, and why. And in fact, in some places, I even tell that this is why this job will be done, because already technology, already automation has come in. In the next 10 years, this will not exist. And people are in denial because I don't know, I think people just don't want change. See, it's not that I
Oh,
want it, but this is what I see will happen.
yeah. Yeah, no, 100%. I think there's definitely a lot of denial. There's a lot of people who think that the change is sort of optional, and like I see this with my friends who sort of think, look, if I don't engage with it, or if I refuse to use it, or if, all the writers go on strike, that we will somehow prevent these technologies from emerging. But I just think the history of humankind shows that not to be the case, because
Correct.
as long as there's somebody who's willing to invent and somebody who's willing to adopt, it's going to happen, and the rest of the world will catch up and be forced to catch up because businesses will find it more efficient to use technology that is more efficient for their processes. Because that's just the history of the human race, is kind of technology moves forward and people get left behind. So I agree. I think there's a lot of heads in the sand. I'm not as pessimistic as a lot of people for the reasons that I've said, that I think if we learn how to use it to our advantage, it can be a huge advantage, even in the creative industries. So I think that on the one hand, but I also think, kind of to your point about jobs being lost, and this is going to sound kind of callous, but I don't really mean it that way. It's like, I suppose I come from a slightly libertarian viewpoint where I sort of think, well, you don't have a right to work the way you've always worked forever, and that's just how it is. I kind of think that's just the nature of humankind, is you have to learn and you have to adapt, and certain jobs may not exist, other jobs will exist. Maybe there are possibilities for things like, Zoltan, who I wrote the book with, and maybe you spoke to him about this when you guys chatted, but he believes that technology opens up the way to a universal basic income that might not have existed in the
Oh, well,
past. And
I for one was against the universal basic income as a concept, but I've become a big convert in the last couple of years because I don't see any other way to sustain. Because there's going to be a period. See, I don't think in our human history we have seen this kind of a time where changes happen such a fast pace and to such a large population.
yeah,
So that is where I become a strong. I like to present a strong argument for universal basic income today, which I used to think is a very communist thinking, right? So, I'm a convert to UBI if you ask me
yeah,
today, because I don't see how we can accommodate. We are 8 billion population. I'm talking to you from Bangalore. Bangalore's population is nearly three times the population of Ireland.
yeah,
I'm talking
yeah,
about one city, right?
right, yeah, yeah,
And of course, India's population is 300 times that.
yeah, yeah,
so,
yeah,
uh, so we are in, and it is today. Next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, we don't know. So we are. I mean, I know the more we talk about it, I'll get negative. So we'll come back to talking about you. So, what scares you? I mean, I know you are trying to be very positive about the future, which is, I also see there are a lot of positive. There is also negative, but from a point of maybe two things. One, of course, you are no longer a journalist, but how do you see? Because I think journalism got quite beaten by the social media itself, right? I mean, user-generated content itself took a lot of breath away from journalists because there's so much of content. And then we are getting into an era where user generated is one aside, but we are talking about machine generated. so, uh, how do you see someone who's getting into being a journalist now? What would you tell him?
yeah. It's an interesting question. Well, I suppose to answer your first question about, what scares me or what worries me. Well, first of all, just to say, we had a conversation, I suppose, before we hit record, just about I was saying I don't think of myself as a journalist. That's just because I'm not involved in reporting, and I'm not involved in the news as such in reporting the news. I would have been more involved in that world when I worked for newspapers back in the day. Now I work for a company called International Living, and I work as an editor for a publication called Global Intelligence Letter, which you can check that out at globalintelligenceletter.com. We're involved, I suppose, in putting out commentary on the global economic situation and on developing technologies, including crypto. But it's mostly from the point of view of advice and opinion. Our industry, I suppose, is more direct mail, more like the newsletter industry of old, where we're kind of delivering folks opinion pieces straight to their email boxes or online. So it's not the mainstream media that most folks would think of. So that's just why I use the words writer and editor and author rather than journalist, just because I'm not involved in reporting. But in terms of what scares me and how I think about the future and what I would say to other folks, first of all, I would say if you want to be a journalist, if you want to be a reporter, if you want to report the news, there's always going to be a need for that. I don't see, like, although media, like you say, has suffered an awful lot, and there are so many other media outlets now, the need for reporting the news, for people to be on the ground in terms of what's happening in Syria or, what's happening anywhere in the world, local news, like that need to document facts and for it to be published, like that's what everything else relies upon. That's what social media exists on. That's why, Joe Rogan is able to comment on what's in the news. So a lot of the other media that we're kind of referencing here kind of is secondary to the need for initial reporting, which still exists. And there's nobody else doing that apart from, maybe some citizen journalists, but apart from the New York Times and Reuters and AP, like nobody reports the news. There are a lot of commentaries on the news, but the objective need for kind of reporting the facts will always exist. So if that's what interests somebody, I don't see a need for that going away. I do see the business model obviously changing, and people are less willing to pay for that. They're more willing to pay for, opinion pieces from commentators that they like on Substack, perhaps. So there's certainly problems with the business model for news, but the need for news has never been greater. And so I think that will always exist. And if people kind of can get the business model right on that, or I think if all of a sudden it stopped, we would suddenly realize how valuable it was. And it's like farming, if all the farmers stopped working, we'd all of a sudden realize like how valuable an industry that was, even though people aren't paid what they should be in it. So that would be my first view in terms of a positive future for news and reporting and journalists. I also think what scares me about the future is kind of exactly what you've said in terms of people not engaging with it. What scares me most about the future is politicians who don't understand artificial intelligence or who try to regulate crypto but have no idea what crypto is. Um, People who put their head in the sand, who just deny the future, who don't want to think about it, or who think that there are other problems that are, maybe more important. Nothing is more important than, how our societies and how our governments operate into the future. And I think unless people are engaged actively with what's happening, especially in the political sphere, then things will be got wrong and people will suffer unnecessarily precisely because they haven't been told, um, what's coming down the tracks and how we all need to adapt for that. Our governments haven't thought about how they need to adapt. And maybe that involves something like UBI, like we're talking about, which again, I philosophically would be, probably against, like yourself, but maybe it needs to be part of the conversation because how do 8 billion people survive in a world where there's only a billion jobs? Maybe that is something we need to think about. So what scares me most about the future is that people aren't embracing it, people aren't attuned to it, people aren't adapted to it. Um, and honestly, what scares me most about the future is that things will be regulated in the wrong way, or will be denied certain advances because of political imperatives. And then this is very personal. I wrote about it in the book, but in the Zoltan book, but it goes back to kind of my experiences with my illness and, uh, bone marrow transplants. So obviously, I have survived because of medical science and medical advances. Um, some things have happened which have benefited people with Fanconi anemia, which certain conservative governments have tried to shut down. Things like embryonic research, things like the ability to say select embryos so that one of them could be a potential transplant donor for somebody with Fanconi anemia. Uh, and there's obviously been opposition to embryonic research and things like that. So what scares me most about the future is the backlash, because I think that can be very dangerous.
True. It's uh, see, the more I see it, it's not that people don't understand. I think people want to use it to manipulate or bring in their own narratives, right? Because see, there are, even when we talk about AI, there are people who say that okay, India will not get affected. Seriously, every country is going to be affected, and then I see the conversations happening with some people and friends and some business conversations with people in US. They talk about AI as a uh, confined to uh, uh, large data and large infrastructural situation. But still, again, see, where there is a conversation, I see that is so limited because uh, uh, maybe by virtue of the major players like Google, Meta, Microsoft, all these guys are big players, and they only want to talk about trillions, right? They don't, or even OpenAI talked about it as $1 trillion and all that. But what touches and impacts people, maybe not you because you are 1 in 2 million, but people like me, uh, are, are, are the small things, and the small things are going to be affected. So we don't have to be worried about only the big data, big infrastructure, expensive resources, but it's going to come into everything. It's going to play at a not even at a phone, at a watch level. Uh, so at edge computing level. So it's going to work with low resource and have much greater impact. But problem is uh, that community who understand technology are also not thinking. So that is the dichotomy I see. Right? I mean, one side you said politicians and others. I mean, I think they probably don't want to understand for their own agenda, but
Right.
those who understand are looking at it in a very narrow lens. So that is what is the unfortunate part, as I see. So, but either ways, it's not very positive. So,
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree with you. There can be a total disconnect, right? If you're at the top and you're running a company that is making billions or trillions, and you're not thinking about how those impacts filter down. It's just not part of your day-to-day life, right? That you're
correct.
interacting with the ordinary people who are using your products. And so I definitely think that's another cause for concern. Um, again, it comes back to just it not being thought through and considered, and all the implications, I suppose, being discussed and um, brought home to people in the way that they should be, because things can move very fast. Governments can't catch up. Businesses maybe aren't attuned to how what they're doing is impacting people. And so the more conversations we can have, the more we can bring things home to people, the more we can make it real to them and part of, folks' everyday lives, and for people themselves to embrace it and think about what it means to them, the better will be. But I do worry that that won't happen to the extent that it needs to. I agree.
So, uh, if you were to think of writing the uh, uh, 1 in 2 million or 2 in a million, right? 2 in a million today, with all the access to technology and all this perspective, which is 20 years later, right? So,
Mhm.
how do you see how different would that book have been?
That's an interesting question because I'm sort of going through that now with the book I'm writing now about me and Sandra that we mentioned. I'm wondering, well, I'm getting writer's block and I'm, thinking, oh, how am I going to structure this chapter properly? Oh, I'll just ask ChatGPT. And I'm like, no, no, I want this book. This will be my last book that I just write myself. After that, I'll help. I'll get help from AI, and it'll come up with all the best chapter ideas, and they'll be much better than mine. So I'm kind of I've been working on this book for 20 years, so I want to kind of challenge myself to complete it without kind of all these aids that are available now. So that's something I just want to do for myself. So it is a question, how going forward will writing be different? If I were to write my first memoir today, would it be different? I mean, sure, emotionally it would just be different 20 years later. I'm sure I'm more mature. I'd have a different perspective on things. I think it could be easier to write because of all these tools. I do worry or wonder, and this is where I would be in tune with my artist friends and folks who are maybe anti technologies like ChatGPT. Like, if we use them as a substitute to think deeply about our own experiences and kind of look within ourselves and contemplate the nature of our own lives, if we use technology as a crutch to kind of help us avoid that, I do think that is a problem. I think technology can be a great augment, it can be a great kind of add on to our lives, but I really don't think it can substitute the need to kind of live the examined life, to use the kind of cliche. I still think we need to be very in tune with who we are, and we need to think deeply about our own interior lives. That's not going to change. The nature of our own brains may change over decades and hundreds of years and thousands of years, but we're still going to have the big brains that we have. Even if artificial intelligence, if we achieve artificial general intelligence, humans are still going to be humans, and we're still going to need to do the kind of introspection and the kind of the work that makes us function well. And I think writing and telling stories and thinking deeply, that all will still be necessary. So I still think we need to do that, even if we have Chat GPT.
Well, before we conclude this part, uh, uh, what what kind of a book would would you like to be remembered as an author of? Right? I mean,
Sure. Well, we began by talking about stories and storytelling and the importance of them. Certainly, my dream has always been to tell a story that really resonates with a lot of people and as many people as possible. I'd like to be remembered as somebody who told a story that had a wide appeal. A wide appeal is one thing. Even just if you write a story that appeals to one person, I think that's worthwhile, even if that one person is yourself. But certainly, it's still my dream to write a story that might impact more widely and become a bestseller. And the best stories are the ones that resonate, I think, across cultures and across different people's experiences. But you tap into something in the human condition that we all identify with. And I think there are examples of that over the course of history, not just in uh, writing, but in culture more generally. But I dream big. I think big. I don't know if I'll ever achieve it, but I kind of think, if you're shooting for the moon, maybe you'll hit the top of the roof or something like that. But
so,
so that's my dream.
do you want to name a author or a book that okay something like that from a point benchmarking it?
Well, I suppose I would think maybe more generally, like one of my um, cultural heroes, certainly growing up, was Michael Jackson, and his music, I think, transcended culture and transcended his own upbringing, and kind of reached people all across the world in a way that even Elvis or the Beatles, who were two other big successful acts, didn't. I think he had an ability to kind of do that in a way that others didn't have. So that kind of cross-cultural impact really interests me, and that's why I was interested in that kind of phenomenon of Michael Jackson growing up. Um, Bestseller wise, culture wise, obviously there are examples like Jurassic Park, I think, which, that book and then the movie, I think spoke to something within the culture at a particular time. It's still relevant now. Something like Frankenstein, um, Homer's Iliad, the Mahabharata. There's so many examples of things that transcend culture and kind of get remade in different cultures.
Well, uh, yeah, nice. I mean, you did start with Michael Jackson, but you ended with Epic. Because I think Michael Jackson was an epic for our generation, but like okay for the for my kids' generation, right? It's like
Right.
okay, so,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
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 but
yeah. It's interesting. No, you're right. I mean, 2000, 3000, 5000 years, will Michael Jackson be remembered? I don't know.
yeah,
The Mahabharata will be remembered, the Iliad will be remembered, the Bible, right? So,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, that's truly epic. That's truly epic.
So uh, yeah, and only befitting 1 in 2 million, right? To say that's how I want to be remembered. So it's only fair. I really wish you all the best, and for the writer, I mean, for the listeners and audience, the links are below this podcast. Look up the book, and also follow his work. Reach out to him and engage him. He responds. So please do reach out and come back soon because we're going to get his perspectives on the future. So until we meet again, enjoy the ride, and yeah, don't forget to share it with all those who you think will appreciate it. Once again, Ben, thank you so much for being you and doing this.
Thank you so much again. Real pleasure.